Hi, I'm Allie. I kind of feel like he said everything that I would have said. I'm currently in London, Ontario, doing my master's in counseling psychology. I just wrapped up my final class for this year, so I'll be heading home to Vancouver, but I'm presenting actually this research study at CPA, the conference at the end of June. So I'll be sticking around Ontario until then to present, and then I'll be heading home. I can't see you guys, so if you do have questions, there will be some time at the end. So I'm not ignoring you if you have your hand up or anything like that. I just only see a picture of the waterfall at UBC. So I guess I'll just hop right into it. So like he said, I'll be discussing aversive racism more broadly, kind of what the definition of it is, and then we'll spend a bit more time looking at it specifically related to the article that I wrote with a team of researchers on it applied to the Muslim women population and access to counseling. So to start off, what is aversive racism? So aversive racism is a form of racial bias or prejudice that occurs when individuals possess both conscious egalitarian beliefs and unconscious negative feelings or attitudes towards members of a particular racial or ethnic group. So it's characterized by conflict between an individual's conscious values of equality and their unconscious biases, which can lead to unintentional discriminatory behaviors or attitudes. In aversive racism, individuals may genuinely believe that inequality and reject overtly racist beliefs, but they may hold implicit bias or harmful stereotypes about certain racial or ethnic groups. These biases are often rooted in societal or cultural influences and can be reinforced by media, upbringing, or personal experiences. And obviously with social media today, that can have a really strong impact on the way that what we're taking in on social media can unconsciously affect the attitudes that we have. So I wanted to, before going further into it as applied to counseling, touch base on a few examples of it more broadly, because while we'll be talking about it applied to counseling today, aversive racism can be found in a lot of different areas. And as you can see on the slide number 3, residential segregation, a lot of the research on aversive racism prior to our work in the counseling sphere has been on housing access. So that's a really important one. But we'll start at the top with unequal treatment. So this can be an employer who genuinely believes in equality, but may unconsciously favor individuals from their own racial or ethnic group or over equally or more qualified candidates from a different racial background. So they might, in their workplace, truly believe that they value that and incorporate those values into their organization. But when it comes to hiring, they might have those unconscious beliefs. Sorry for the sound. Implicit biases in decision making. So in this case, it's a police officer, and despite holding egalitarian beliefs, may unconsciously perceive a person of color as more threatening or suspicious, leading to disproportionate scrutiny or engagement in situations. So they may believe that they would do the same thing to any other person, but their unconscious behaviors are making them treat somebody of a different background as themselves a bit differently. And then, like I said, residential segregation. So homeowners or landlords may unknowingly engage in discriminatory practices when it comes to renting or selling properties, resulting in segregated communities based on race or ethnicity, which I think that we can all recognize is still an issue today. And then nonverbal cues. So individuals may exhibit subtle nonverbal cues, such as avoiding eye contact or exhibiting discomfort when interacting with people from certain racial or ethnic groups, despite their conscious commitment to equality. So all of these may apply to ourselves, like we can act out in all of these ways, but these are some different ways that you can apply them to other, non-counseling situations to help give you a better idea of aversive racism and how it plays out in our society. So how is aversive racism different from explicit forms of racism? So aversive racism and explicit forms of racism differ in their manifestations and underlying motivations. So let's explore these distinctions. So as I'm sure most of us know, explicit racism refers to the overt or deliberate expressions of racial prejudice or discrimination. And it involves individuals who openly endorse and display biased attitudes and behaviors towards people from different racial or ethnic backgrounds. Examples of implicit racism include racial slurs, engaging in hate speech, or actively promoting segregation or discriminatory policies. So it's very overt, it's very conscious. They're not really trying to hide anything when they're engaging in explicit racism. On the other side, aversive racism is a more subtle form and an unconscious form of bias. And it occurs when individuals who genuinely believe in equality and non-prejudice still hold hidden negative feelings and attitudes towards certain racial or ethnic groups. And these biases are often rooted in implicit associations developed through repeated exposure to societal stereotypes. So very similar to what I said earlier. The motivations behind explicit racism and aversive racism are also different, like I said. So explicit racists are driven by an overt belief in racial superiority or the desire to maintain power and dominance. And their actions and biases are more overt, intentional, and consciously expressed. And on the other hand, individuals who, with aversive racism, consciously strive to appear non-prejudiced and egalitarian. So it's very conscious that it's their goal to come off as egalitarian as possible. And they may actively reject explicit forms of racism. So it's like they might be fighting against those who are exhibiting explicit racism and genuinely endorse the principles of equality. However, at the unconscious level, they hold biases and negative feelings towards certain racial or ethnic groups. And the motivations behind aversive racism include self-preservation, avoiding the label of being racist, and maintaining a positive self-image as a non-prejudiced individual. So it's really clear here that the motivations are different, and it's very much at the level of wanting to appear as egalitarian as possible, as promoting of equality as possible, which we'll discuss later in more detail, but is very relevant to the field of counseling. We want to come across as being as open and accepting of any client that might walk in our door as possible. But at an unconscious level, that may not be the case. And in terms of expression and impact, explicit racism is openly displayed and its discriminatory actions are easily recognizable, and it leads to direct harm and discrimination towards targeted racial or ethnic groups, as we've seen in media. But in contrast, aversive racism is a lot more subtle and often expressed through indirect behaviors or microaggressions. So the person who it's impacting may not even realize that there's any racial lies act being held against them. And it may result in unintentional differential treatment or more subtle forms of exclusion. So it contributes to systemic inequalities and maintaining social divisions. And like I said, like both the person who's perpetrating and the person who's receiving it may not even know that any form of racism is taking place. And that's why the research around this is really important and bringing it to people's attention. And so you might be wondering, like, what is the clear distinction between aversive racism and implicit bias? Because they kind of do go hand in hand. So the aversive racism framework is different from implicit bias, which we often measure through the implicit association test in terms of how it explains the bias. So in the ARF, or the aversive racism framework, it provides a more comprehensive understanding of implicit bias by considering various factors. It helps identify who is more likely to show subtle racism. So speaking to the piece on how those who hold more egalitarian beliefs may be more guilty of practicing an aversive racism, and predicts the specific situations in which discriminatory behaviors may occur. So like I said, a lot of the research has focused on like rental and housing aspects of as being where aversive racism may take place. And explores both conscious and unconscious factors that contribute to such behavior. So while implicit bias mainly focuses on that unconscious level, the IAT, we're not looking at any conscious factors when we use that. Aversive racism is identifying that at a conscious level, people who are engaging in aversive racism really do have or to try to express egalitarian values and promote equality as much as they can. So those are the main differences between the two there. And aversive racism also, the theory takes into account the motivations of emotions, physiology, and cognitive processes, while the IAT primarily focuses on cognitive processes. So it's a more all-encompassing framework. And it's considered a better predictor of physiological threat reactions. So unlike the aversive racism framework, the IAT continues to be questioned for its ability to make accurate predictions of real-world discrimination. But as you'll see, unlike the IAT, the aversive racism framework can be applied to real-world situations, which is exactly what our study did. And our focus was on access to counseling and psychotherapy services for different religious groups. In particular, for this study, we wanted to explore if there was a difference in access between Muslim women and non-Muslim women to counseling and psychotherapy services. So before going into the details, the methodology, and what we found in our study, I did want to discuss a little bit about, as applied to the counseling psychotherapy realm, what does aversive racism framework suggest we should expect? What does the theory say should be seen in this area if aversive racism exists? So practitioners with aversive racism, based on the theories, they suggest that they may try to show that they are not prejudiced by treating marginalized group members like Muslims in a more positive and timely manner. And they want to prove to themselves and others that they are fair and equal. This can happen regardless of the specific situation or request that they are responding to. And research suggests that people with aversive racism can hide their unconscious biases effectively, especially when they are aware that others can see their discriminatory behavior. So this might be staff in their practice, if administrative staff might also have access to their emails, or if it's a more public interaction, not over email or like a more anonymous source, that can be a way that they would hide it more. So for example, when communicating through impersonal means like email, like I said, they can avoid showing their negative biases. However, when they have direct contact with marginalized individuals or expect it, and when there are many options for how to respond, there's no one way, there's limited chances for being caught, and there's unclear guidelines for what's appropriate, individuals with aversive racism might unknowingly express bias in subtle ways. So it's not to say that anybody's going against their ethical guidelines or that they're consciously aware of being quote unquote caught. But when there's opportunities where they kind of have that autonomous decision on which way to go, they might unconsciously make a choice to avoid contact with the individual who comes from a different background than themselves. So for instance, this can happen when they decide to offer an appointment. So through email, we can go back and forth, we can discuss the client's concerns, we can talk about how often they might want to see a therapist to decide whether or not that counselor has the capacity to take on this client. But when it comes to actually offering them an appointment where they will be face-to-face with that person, they may then come up with some type of reason for why they may not be able to take on that client. And that reason will not be related to race, religion, or any marginalized status that the person may have. So oftentimes, and in our article, that came up as, that can come up as that their wait list is too long, or they don't have the specialization in that area with the clients presenting concerns, or various other non-race related or religion related excuses for not offering an appointment. So why might they do this? They do this to maintain the image of being non-prejudiced and to avoid confronting their biases directly. It's important to know that practitioners in private practice who can choose their clients don't want to reject too many clients from marginalized groups. So the authors of this theory make sure this may not be the case for all individuals of outgroups, especially in a counseling practice. You can't be you can't outwardly reject all individuals from marginalized groups. So they don't appear discriminatory based on the types of clients that they work with. But with aversive racism, they are unlikely to offer appointments more frequently to clients from outside their usual group. So they want to strike a balance. So they're not going to have more clients that are outside of their race, religious, other marginalized status group. They'll try to make it as even as possible, rather than so working from a more equality stance than an equity stance. And they want to avoid working primarily with clients that hold that they hold biases against, while still appearing fair and equal in their responses. And again, this is all happening at an unconscious level. So while it might seem it's very confusing at times, I know for me it took a while to wrap my head around. They're not outwardly leveling their charts on Excel to make sure that everybody's on that it's all balanced out. But at a unconscious level, they're manifesting this. So yeah. So speaking directly to our study, with all of this information at hand, looking through the aversive racism framework and the literature that exists, and all of these kind of behaviors being suggested as what we should look out for in our research. And if these things exist, then we might be seeing aversive racism happening at Access to Counseling. We had 3 hypotheses. So the first is that having a Muslim name rather than a non-Muslim name will lead to a greater number of return emails from practitioners. So practitioners will be more responsive to the Muslim client. And this is because, like I said earlier, they want to promote egalitarian beliefs. They want to seem like they value equality. So they're going to respond to the Muslim client at a faster or more frequent rate. The second hypothesis is that they will respond to the Muslim individual at a faster rate. So we think that they thought that based on that, they're going to respond at a faster rate. They're going to respond more often, but at the end of the day, they will not be more receptive to the Muslim client. That means that either the non-Muslim client will have more appointment offers, or it will be equal. So that kind of works in line with what I said earlier. They really want to seem as equal as possible, but when it comes down to who is going to be showing up to my office, we're going to strike a balance, or we're going to favor the in-group that we are a part of. And so to do this, our independent variable was perceived religion. So the one client was identified as being a Muslim woman, and the other condition was a non-Muslim woman, but there's no specified religion. We still had that variable, that person be religious, in the sense that they were perceived as coming from our religion, but it was very broad and not specific. And when we ran a pilot within our lab, there was no specific religion that stood out to any of the members who filled out the survey as to what that religion that individual came from. So it was really clear that it was either Muslim or other religion and not specific at all. And then to our dependent variables were responsiveness. So did they respond or did they not? Receptiveness. So did they offer an appointment? Yes or no? And then we did have some in between variables of they asked for questions. So it was kind of an ambiguous condition. And then time to respond. So how fast did they respond to each client? And then so for our methodology, we use an audit methodology, which if you're not familiar, it's a type of experimental design that allows researchers to investigate implicit bias in real world settings, and participants are unaware of their participation. So to do this, we sampled 450 counselors or psychologists in the Greater Vancouver area, working in private practice, and specifically worked with adults and women. So not any practitioners who only worked with children or only worked with men. So to do this, we use several databases, like counseling databases with all Psychology Today, but specific to the BC area, and plugged in the different cities in the Greater Vancouver area, took everybody that was on those databases, and then randomly sampled 450 of those. And then of those, the first 225 were assigned to the Muslim condition, and the second were assigned to the non-Muslim condition. And I don't go into it in this presentation, but we did do a first run through to rule with a completely ambiguous email to rule out anybody who had the email bounced or who might not be practicing right now. So if that was the case, we would just take the next person on our list out of the 450, the extended list past the 450, and we'd place them in that person's spot. So here's an example of what we sent for each person. So as you can see, all of the information is basically exactly the same. So in terms of the emails at the top, you can see that they're both formatted the same way. The only reason that the Jessica condition had a middle name was because the other option wasn't available without it. And then the emails are exactly the same in format. And then we included a quote at the end to really enforce the religious aspect of it and make sure that that was a salient variable to the counselors, because of course sometimes they might scale over the name or something like that. So we used similar quotations. They weren't exactly the same, but they were taken from the same origin, so that there wasn't any major differences in that capacity. And then for the first one, we used a like a popular Muslim author, and then for the second one, we just used white Canadian author that's well known, to try to keep it as equal as possible there. So that's kind of what the emails looked like, and we kind of scattered them out so that they didn't go to spam, and each person received one or the other, not both. And so for the results, in the Muslim condition, 78.6% responded with 36.4% of those offering or being receptive to scheduling an appointment. And on the other hand, so in the non-Muslim condition, 62.1% responded, with 45.3% of those offering or being receptive to an appointment. So as you can see here, the Muslim client did actually receive more responses. And I don't think it might be in here somewhere, but I don't think it is. I don't think we talked about it as much in our final paper, but they actually received faster responses as well. But ultimately, they didn't receive the percentage of actually offered appointments was higher for the non-Muslim clients. So even though they received more, and even though they received faster responses, the non-Muslim client was actually more capable of being offered an appointment in a significant way. So as a result, we found that the Muslim client was significantly less likely to be offered an appointment. So that's a huge result. And we actually, I didn't mention it, and I don't know if it's been mentioned before, but we, but one of the former grad student who was on this project with me, she did her thesis on this with Muslim men, and she found very different results. So it was really interesting for us to have this new result. And there's situational factors that played into explaining those results, but it was really interesting to see that there is a different outcome for this study. And so what does all this mean? Although practitioners responded more frequently to the Muslim woman's emails, she did have a lower success rate in scheduling appointments. So basically exactly what the aversive racism framework would have suggested we would expect if aversive racism was playing a role is what happened. So we suggest that practitioners with aversive prejudice towards Muslim clients may unconsciously avoid working with them and rationalize their denial of services based on other factors while looking on the surface like they are not prejudiced. And in my case, the most common form of rejection was saying that they had a wait list and there would be too long to get that client in, which I feel like is a very easy and common response that can be used as a way to avoid working with a certain client without saying, having it relate to any religious or racial factor. And as you could see in the content of the email, we're working with low mood and sadness, and sleep issues. So not much with there was not much room for the counselor to say that they weren't competent in that area. It was in a very niche area of concern. So we didn't really get any responses saying that wasn't their area of practice. So it was definitely majority, either no responses or saying that they didn't have the space. And so what does that mean for us as counselors? All of us, including myself, are on our way to becoming counselors and working in the field. I know I'm starting my internship in September. And so going forward, it's important for practitioners to understand that aversive prejudice, that it exists, and realize that bias, communication and with potential clients may not always be obviously prejudiced. And in fact, it can appear fair and equal. So like I said, they received more responses. So they receive faster responses. So it may seem at the end of the day that they're being equal or even favor the outgroup, but at the end of the day, that's not the case. And avoiding contact completely would contradict their image of being a fair practitioner. So they do actively engage, and they do seem like they're interested as a way to hold in their self-image that they do have those egalitarian beliefs, and they are equal, like they do favor equality, but that's not necessarily the case as we see from our results. So training programs have tried to increase cultural competence and awareness of implicit biases amongst psychologists to address practitioner discrimination, and that's, I'm sure, why many of you might be taking this class. And I know I took a cross-cultural class for this exact reason as well, to try to strengthen my cultural competence. However, such training has often been ineffective in real-world outcomes. And so until better anti-bias training is developed, which may be this class, it's up to practitioners to learn how to treat clients without aversive biases. So one way to avoid this is in appointment scheduling that we suggest in our article is to create a system that hides client social identity information when deciding which clients to take on. So maybe if you have administrative staff, they block out any identifiable information, and it leaves it bound to maybe gender, if we want to include that, and then the presenting concern. And if we think that we're able to work with that presenting concern and we have time, then we can take that client on, and that takes away any possibility of race or religious factors playing a role in our decision to take on that client. And then another way is to develop an objective procedure for client selection and follow it very carefully and stringently. But that still leaves room a little bit for practitioner error. We have to just trust that people are going to be following that, and we can't, obviously, based on the results of this, necessarily do that. So if we do incorporate these strategies and we do use them well, we could provide better access for marginalized clients like Muslims, but they come with a risk. So if at the end of the day, the practitioner truly does lack cultural competence and are unwilling to develop it, their services may be ineffective or even harmful. So if we do incorporate these strategies of, employing a equitable and non-biased appointment scheduling process, that's great. But what if the practitioner does lack cultural competence with that person or that client in that group, and then they serve as ineffective or potentially even harmful counselors? So these are things to keep in mind. So practitioners need to be very upfront about their limitations in working with certain identity groups and exclude them from their client summaries. So that kind of goes against what we were talking about with preserving self-image and coming across as this all-encompassing counselor and being able to work with anybody. And I think we need to acknowledge our limitations in that area. Like, I can't speak for cultural groups that are my own, and I work to have knowledge on those groups so that I can be an effective counselor for them. But there may be certain areas that I'm not the best counselor to be there for them, and we need to be able to recognize that and take a little bit of the hit there to our egos and be able to say that. To address that, practitioners should set a timeline and work for when they expect to be competent enough to work with specific groups, and actively be seeking out that education or consultation with specialists to be able to add that to their group of clients that they can take on. It can't be like I'm not competent in that area and then let's just ignore it. It needs to come with a dedication to education and willingness to train and take on that. So encouraging practitioners to recognize their biased behaviors and subtly pointing out these biases can lead to self-initiated changes over time. And especially if we as counselors do want to preserve that self-image, but being able to point that out to each other and really work to promote a more non-biased access to services kind of process. If we want to maintain that self-image, we will work to make those changes, right? So the self-regulation can reduce biased behaviors and motivate practitioners to overcome their prejudices. And I'll go to this slide. Here's the last one, if it works. Oh, there we go. So the same authors who came up with the Aversive Racism framework came up with the common in-group identity model. And together the two suggest that it would be good for therapists and counselors and in general people in training to have opportunities to work with individuals from different groups. So whether that be our cohorts for the program being diverse and we're working with people of different groups, or joining psychology social groups on campus, whether it be like psychi, I think that's what it's called, the undergrad psychology honors thing. But having that diversity of individuals in our social groups can help reduce the sense of like out-group bias, and there's been evidence to show that when people are involved in like team capacities with people who are from a different group than them, that they do have a sense of like in-group, like a shared in-group with those individuals, and there is bias that is reduced as a result. So increasing that on campus would be a great first step. And if the organizational level won't do that, if the places that we work for or the schools that we attend aren't providing those opportunities, seeking them out for ourselves to make sure that we're not facilitating a space that is conducive for aversive racism to take place, whether that be, and that might be unconscious, but by working against it actively at a conscious level, we can help reduce the likelihood of that happening in our spaces, and therefore increase the likelihood of equal access to services for all individuals, but in this case, Muslim women. Yeah, so that's kind of all of the information that I have. I'm sorry if I talked fast, I have a habit for that. But if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now. I can't see, so I'm sure that there's a different way to facilitate questions, yes, or clarifications that might be necessary.
So thank you so much, Ali, for sharing your time and talking about your research study, which I will add was published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology, which is the top counseling psychology journal in the world. And so this was a great accomplishment. It's an excellent study here. And this was for her independent study project. So with that said, does anybody have any questions or comments for Ali about her study or about the concept of aversive racism? Yeah, and maybe project your voice and then hopefully she can hear. I'll repeat the question then.
Okay,
go ahead.
Good. Thank you for such an interesting talk. I was wondering, have you come across any research or authors that speak to how aversive racism shows up in counseling sessions?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we study was the first to look at aversive racism in the counseling space, I believe, right? So between hers and my study, we've only looked at access, and then I believe one of your current grad students is looking at it with a different population, but still at access, right? So I don't think any studies have looked at it from the inside yet, and I think that would take a lot of careful consideration with the structure of how we do that from an ethical standpoint as well. So it would be interesting to kind of plug away at how that would be possible, but I don't, as far as I know, there hasn't been any of that yet to this point.
Great, thank you for that question. Does anybody else have any questions or comments?
Also, if you can give them my email if you want. If anybody has questions outside, if they think about it longer and they have questions, they can ask me. You can access the study on the UBC library as well if you want to take a read through it. And if any questions come up, you're more than welcome to contact me and I can try to answer those as well if nothing's coming to mind right now.
Yeah, just project your voice, please. Thank you.
Mine's kind of more practical. I'm just interested in whether like the results of this work have made you or like your teammates maybe want to like continue to develop this topic. Like where do you take this from here, essentially?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that in our discussion when we were working on like planning out this project, we talked about maybe looking at it in a different population. We see Vancouver as being a more, well-grounded and culturally accepting area of Canada, whereas other places might be a little bit less accepting. So we talked about maybe doing it with a different population and seeing if those results are more prevalent. And then I know one of the grad students right now, Maria, is doing this with Sikh clients. So kind of expanding it to different groups of individuals was something that we discussed as a whole. Right now, my research is not in this area, just based on what's offered by my program, but it's definitely been something that I've been able to bring to my class. A lot of people hadn't heard of Aversive Racism. It's something that we discussed in more detail. So it's been really interesting to be able to bring this kind of information to a new group of people who are now more aware of it. And as a whole, we can work together to kind of come up with strategies to reduce it in our internships coming up. So it's been really cool to be able to share that knowledge that I've gained from it with other practitioners. So to see it really at a practical level has been really interesting. But I think working with different locations and different clients is a really good step to kind of see if this is common in other areas of the country or the world more broadly.
So I have a question for you, Ali. So after doing this study, after learning about aversive racism, how has this or will it affect your actual practice in session with clients? So another way of saying is, if you didn't know this, what would you be doing differently? Or now that you know this, what are you going to be doing now?
Well, for starters, I won't have any say on who I have as clients at an internship level. So this won't directly impact the access to services part. I don't think it'll play a role for a while. But it's definitely made me open my eyes to when we've had discussions in class and stuff like that, when we said, oh, like that's equal access, or that's like good, competent counseling. And we've had these conversations. I've been like, but wait, like, have we considered like the other side of like, maybe this person is like expressing these views outwardly, but at the level of like their practice, like, is this still holding true? So it's been really interesting to kind of play with it a little bit at like an academic level of seeing like, is it what we like, not taking things at face value and kind of digging a little bit more. In practice, I just don't know yet. But I definitely think it'll be more something that I'm more aware of. And like, I think I'm consciously seeking out opportunities to learn about cultures outside of my own to gain that competence, because I don't want myself to ever be like, well, I'm not competent enough, and like you let that be an excuse for not working with certain clients, even if potentially at an unconscious level there's something else at play. So just making sure that I do as much research and workshops and different stuff. And I think that my program has offered a lot of great opportunities to do to like kind of create our own clients when we discuss certain things. And so it's been really neat to like try to find to create clients that are outside of our comfort zone, to kind of set ourselves up for comfort in the counseling space in September. And so I do feel like through that work of like actively trying to work on projects and creating those clients that I might typically have been like, oh no, I don't really know what to do because I don't know that cultural group very well. I kind of try to erase that by doing my own self-research, whether it be in class or outside, and engaging in workshops and stuff outside of the program as a whole to try to strengthen my ability to just be a good counselor, and not have any excuses for not working with clients based on a competency level. But of course, there's always more work to do at that.
Great, thank you for that. Does anybody else have any more questions or comments about the research study about aversive racism for Ali? Okay. Well, that takes us to the end of the question period. Ali, I'm so appreciative you've taken the time out of your afternoon to share your research and to share its applications to counseling access. And I hope helping the people in the audience here understand about aversive racism can help their own practices and make sure that they're not reproducing aversive racism, at least at the level of selecting clients to work with. So thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we end our conversation?
Nope, I don't think so. Like I said, you can contact me if you have any other questions, and otherwise, I'll see you at CPA. But yeah, that's everything for me.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful day.
You too.